In the past 3 years or so, I've tested about 150 different speakers. Out of those, about 100 of them have been under about $2,500. And out of those 100, roughly 90 of them are bookshelf type speakers or maybe even Bluetooth speakers. You can imagine that I've got a lot to pull from when people say, "What do you recommend for a speaker under X price?" After my top 5 personal favorite speakers, I had a lot of requests to do a more budget-friendly speaker shootout style video. But rather than going strictly on the budget of about $500 or below, I decided to expand that to $2,500 because, in my opinion, when you want to get good looks and good sound quality, you really have to step your budget up to closer to about $1,000 and a little bit over that to get even better performance. Having said that, I don't believe that you necessarily have to spend more than $2,000 or $3,000 to get really good performance. But in some cases, what you're paying for really is just the look more than the sound quality. In this video, I'm going to talk about my favorite speakers under $2,500. And you'll notice that these speakers don't share a lot of similarities. And what I mean by that is, rather than me objectively looking at the data and saying, this speaker has a score of this, or this speaker has a more perfect linearity than this speaker, I really wanted to make this a little bit more wide. I wanted to look at different speakers for different reasons. So I'm going to talk about powered speakers. I'm going to talk about small speakers. I'm going to talk about larger bookshelf speakers. But the one common theme is that I think these represent a good gamut of different types of designs that I think are all good in their own right. The important thing for me to stress is that when I talk about these speakers, pay attention to the data that I'm going to show you. And I am going to leave out some data because I just don't have the time to go everything. There is no perfect speaker, and I really want to stress that, and I hope everyone understands what I mean when I say it, and if you don't, let me describe a little bit. Everybody has different tastes when it comes to looks or maybe even sound to some degree. Now, we know through research that it has been documented most people prefer a flat on-axis sound with a smooth off-axis response. So I'm going to show you speakers that do that, but they all have varying degrees of linearity and off-axis width, radiation width. Those things matter. Looks matter. Size of the speaker matters as well. There are intangibles that we can't really talk about, and there are tangibles that we can definitely talk about when it comes to why we choose a speaker. I'm going to hit on the ones that I think are important to look at, maybe be good contenders for your consideration. And once this video is done, I hope you have a better appreciation for why data is important. It's not just a fixture that I throw up on the wall and I look and say, hey, here's data. It helps us to understand why a speaker may be more preferred than another speaker. For example, if you have two speakers that are good in linearity and good in off-axis response, good distortion, all the metrics are good, but maybe one is a little bit worse objectively, but that one also looks better, well, odds are I'm going to choose the one that looks better. And with that, let's go ahead and dive into this list that I put together for you. All of my measurements are done using the Klippel near-field scanner. This allows me to get anechoic measurements in a non-anechoic environment, and this is important to have because you're able to remove the speaker from the room and understand what is going on with just the speaker. We are going to start with the Emotiva B1 Plus, which retails for about $350 a pair, but you can find it on sale for around $280 right now. The speaker features a 5¼ inch midwoofer and a folded ribbon tweeter. We can see from the anechoic data that this speaker has pretty reasonable linearity, and if you look at it, you can see that it's within about plus or minus 3 decibels from about 100 hertz to maybe about 10 kilohertz, which is okay. It's not great, but it's really not bad, especially for the price. There is a bit of a shelf dip right through here, and back in my review, I wasn't quite sure if this is due to a series of resonances that we see right around this particular area that are due from the cabinet wall, or if it's just a baffle step issue, but luckily, it's reasonably minor, again, if you're considering the cost of these speakers. The early reflections directivity index really looks quite good for this particular speaker, which means it will take well to equalization. And then if we look at the estimated in-room response, we can see that it has a pretty decent trend line going through. So if you drew an imaginary line going through this, we would see that what you might have is a peaking around 1 to 2 kilohertz, which is going to add a little bit of extra maybe presence or attack depending on how you define things. Now that may be okay with you or you may not like it, but it's important to note I would also consider it the opposite of a laid back sound. The dispersion is about plus or minus 60 degrees as we see here, but those resonances that I talked about earlier crop up in this particular area and toward the back of the speaker. So it's likely cabinet resonances floating from the port on the rear of the speaker. All in all though, for the price, a really great speaker and one that I highly recommend if you're looking at a budget speaker to get you into this audiophile world. Next up on the list is the ELAC DBR62. Retail price is $700 per pair. It features a 1-inch tweeter and a 6.5-inch midwoofer. On-axis linearity is about plus or minus 2.5 decibels, which is really quite good. All things considered, I guess I should put that caveat on there. There's a little bit of a mid-bass bump here, which subjectively I like, and it's about plus or minus maybe 2 dB or so, depending on where you draw the trend line. I'm drawing it right through here with an average sensitivity of about 85 decibels at 2.83 volts, 1 meter. The early reflections directivity index, which is kind of a gauge for how equalizable the speaker is going to be, looks pretty good until you get to around 3-4 kilohertz or so. So you're not going to be able to do much about that area. And if we look at the estimated in-room response, we can see that, yeah, there's a little bit of a peaking going on in this particular area where you're not really going to be able to equalize that. If you turn the speaker on axis facing directly toward you, you get what you have in the black line, which may be a tad bit bright in room. So what you can do is you can turn the speaker off axis by as much as 30 degrees. It'll take down that top end just a little bit. Horizontal radiation width, about plus or minus 50 to 60 degrees, depending on where you want to draw the line. And to me, this is really kind of a sweet spot speaker. At its price, it's one that, again, I really have no problem recommending. And I like that it does look nice for the price as well. Next up on the list is the Orindall 1961 bookshelf speaker. This speaker runs about $800 per pair, features a 5.25-inch midwoofer with a 1-inch dome tweeter sunk into a nice waveguide. This speaker has very limited bass excursion, and you may be wondering, well, why would I put it on the list? Well, the reason is simple. If you have a small room that you're trying to set up a home theater in, these speakers are perfect for at least the surrounds and possibly the mains, as long as you use a subwoofer. And I would recommend using a subwoofer up to about 120 hertz, maybe 100 hertz, but that will be pushing it in my opinion. If you look at the early reflections directivity index, there's a couple regions where you're going to have a little bit of trouble equalizing this speaker. That's mainly going to be in the higher frequencies where there's some diffraction dips on axis that don't quite translate to the off axis response. But if you look at the estimated in-room response, you get a pretty good idea of 0 degrees and 30 degrees on axis and off axis, what the speaker is going to do. So it's going to sound a little bit mellow in the upper mid-range. You may lose some attack or some detail in that 1 to 3 kilohertz region that I'm showing here, but you're going to pick right back up in the treble around 3 to 4 kilohertz. So some particular things you may want to equalize, and in those particular areas, you can do so very, very easily. Radiation on this speaker is pretty narrow, and it's narrower than most speakers that I would prefer, but sometimes a narrow radiation speaker just works better in your room, especially if you have a room that is highly reflective. Flip the nines, $1,500 per pair, power speakers. The reason I like this speaker is because not only is it a power speaker, but it gets low, has excellent on-axis response if you use the app to drop down some of the treble, but it has HDMI input. And that's really important, especially if you just try to keep things simple and you want a really good alternative to a soundbar. As we can see, the on-axis response is really quite good. The bass gets down to about 40 hertz anechoic, F3. And then in room, you can expect possibly to get down as low as 30 hertz. Now, there is some compression limiting built into the speaker, so you're not going to get to that frequency at really high volumes, but it should do good to satisfy most people's need in a standard room. Early reflections directivity down here indicate you're not going to be able to EQ as much in this particular area at the crossover. Now that's due to the vertical distance between the tweeter and the midwoofer below it. So most of that is not going to be much of a problem as long as you're sitting on axis with the tweeter. But going higher than that, you can see that the directivity is almost flat, which means that you can EQ this speaker to your heart's desire above about 1 kilohertz. Estimated in-room response on axis in black looks pretty good. Now, if I drew a trend line through here, I would say that you're going to miss a little bit of this 1.5 kilohertz area, and that the high end might sound a little bit bright to you above about 6 kilohertz. But if you turn the speaker 30 degrees off axis where it's parallel with the wall behind it, then you can see that the high frequency drops down some. Now, you do have this peaking going on, which is some sort of breakup or potential diffraction effect. I'm not sure which one. Is that going to be an issue up there at that high of a frequency? I can't really say. I can tell you, though, that in my listening sessions, I didn't find it to be problematic. The radiation of the speaker is extremely narrow. It's even more narrow than the Orindall 1961 bookshelf that we just looked at. Now, again, the same thing applies. For some rooms, this may be what you want. For other rooms, maybe not so much. So you'll want to play around with the aiming to make sure you get the best sound for your seated position. Wharfdale Linton 85. This is a ringer at this point. This is one of my favorite speakers, especially at its price point of about $1,500 to $2,000, depending on if you find them on sale and you buy with or without the stands. This is a three-way design that features an 8-inch midwoofer, 5-inch mid-range, and a 1-inch tweeter. And I would say that it has a laid-back sound. Why do I say that? Well, there is a dip in this particular region of about 1 kilohertz. And if we go look at the estimated in-room response, we can see if we drew a trend line that we would have a little bit of a dip in that particular region. So some voices may sound a little bit hollow. Some sounds may not be quite as percussive. But for me, that's a trade-off that I'm willing to make for a speaker that really is pretty much firing on all cylinders for my subjective tastes. Now, on axis, maybe a little bit bright, just a tad. Make sure you use the speaker with the grill because that's how it's designed to be listened to. Tone off axis, 30 degrees to me, maybe that's reasonable. Personally, I found about 10 degrees seem to work the best, and that will fill in this little bit, a little bit more, and also take a little bit off the top end. As far as EQ ability goes for this speaker, though, there's not a lot you can do in this, I'd say about 2 to 3 kilohertz region because there's some diffraction effects going on there. But for the most part, I don't think that users of this particular speaker are wanting to use EQ. And I will say that I don't think you have to. The bass does get low. It gets to about an F3 of 50 hertz or so. In room, I'd say you can get down to about 40 hertz. So it's not going to cover the lowest of lows. And if you plan to listen to music that has a lot of low frequency content, then you're going to want to use a subwoofer. Radiation of the speaker is quite wide, about plus or minus 70 to 80 degrees, and it's maybe just a tad too wide for my general likes, but it's not too wide for me. The Philharmonic BMR monitor speaker runs about $1,700 per pair or $1,900 per pair, depending on the cabinet. It's a three-way design with a 6-inch midwoofer, a 2.5-inch BMR mid-range, and then a RAL ribbon tweeter. Some of you may wonder why this is on my list because if you recall, although it's a great speaker, it just didn't fit my personal likes because I felt like the radiation pattern was too wide. And because it was too wide, I felt like the imaging wasn't quite as precise in room as maybe it was on other speakers with a little bit more of a narrow radiation pattern. And that's why I put the speaker on here, because it's different. Some people might like a speaker with a wider radiation pattern. And if you have maybe a very absorbent room, it might be something to consider, or maybe you just like a speaker that really illuminates the walls a lot. And that's what this speaker is going to do. Now, why do I say it does that? Here you go. Now, it's similar in radiation width to the Wharfdale, but I do find that this particular speaker was a bit wider. I'd say about 5 to 10 degrees, which is enough to make me go, personally, maybe a little bit too wide, but some of you may really like that. The build quality is there, frequency response is there. The early reflections directivity index down here looks really good. So the speaker takes well to EQ if you choose to use it. In room, the speaker will get down into the 40s without issue. The estimated in-room response at 0 degrees and 30 degrees show pretty much the same thing, except for this particular region right there, which that's about half a dB to a dB at most delta. That's not a big deal. What I want to point out, though, is that notice the high frequency, they pretty much overlap. Well, that's because the speaker is so widely radiating, but it does so uniformly, which is a great thing. That's what you want in a speaker, because then you can toe it out, toe it in. You can play with aiming to get something that you like more without sacrificing a lot. You can also equalize the speaker if you want to, and you'll get a better sound for your personal needs. Fr3 Meta at $2,200 per pair. Great speaker. Linearity is excellent, probably one of the best that I've measured so far. Estimated in-room response is also excellent. I think the only caveat that I have with this speaker is that it is output limited to some degree. Now, it's only using a 6.5-inch midwoofer, so I can't expect it to do crazy bass levels. And you will want to use a subwoofer with this speaker, just like you do pretty much any of the other speakers that I've already covered. And with a coincident design, you never really want to listen to them directly facing you. You normally want to toe them out or toe them in a little bit. I would recommend about 10 degrees because that seems to hit the sweet spot. If we do that, we can see the response is pretty much dead flat. The early reflections directivity index looks great. There is a little bit of a deviation around 2.5 kilohertz. So in that particular area, if you wanted to EQ something, you might have a little bit of an issue. But overall, the early reflections directivity index looks excellent. This speaker is going to take very, very well to equalization. Bass extension looks kind of funky. It's an extended bass shelf. What that means is, in some ways, it acts like a standard sealed enclosure where it just rolls off at about 12 dB per octave. But then you've got the port coming in to extend the bass a little bit more. Now, the idea behind this is that it gives you a little bit more bass extension in room without resonating or being too boomy in the room. If that's a trade-off that you like, it's worth considering. Estimated in-room response of this speaker is like textbook when we're talking about its variability from on axis to off axis. So what I've shown here is 0 to 10 degrees, and I didn't show 30 degrees because this particular speaker, I wouldn't toe it out that much. I think 10 degrees is pretty much where you need to be. The radiation pattern of the speaker horizontally, a little bit more narrow than I personally care for. My sweet spot is about 60 degrees to 70 degrees, give or take. Now, this one's closer to 40 to 50 degrees, depending on the frequency that you look at, but it is very, very uniform. And there you have it. That's the speakers that I would recommend for varying reasons. Now, if you're new to this channel and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing that. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up if you like the video. I'll throw some affiliate links to some of these speakers in the description below. So if you're interested in purchasing any of the speakers that I've talked about and you want to help out the channel, please consider using one of those affiliate links. If you're interested in joining me at patreon.com/Erin's Audio Corner, that's where I interact with my patrons directly. I do polls, I show them behind the scenes information, and I post videos up a little bit early so they get a heads up on them. Doing that helps me keep this channel going, and it really is fun to interact with them as well. I appreciate you watching this video, and I truly hope you learned something, if not necessarily about what I think about speakers. Maybe you've learned a little bit about how to use the data to come to good conclusions about what makes sense for you to buy. I'll talk to you all later. Take care. Peace.